wonderful day!
Every time we get a trailer for a new Planet of the Apes movie, people wonder just where the latest film in the Venerable series takes place in the Apes timeline. From the Andy Serkis trilogy to the original movies to various other offshoots, this is a franchise that spans thousands of years, and not just that, but it also takes place over a variety of timelines. Basically, the chronology of the Planet of the Apes movies is a total mess, totally crazy, but also, and this is the most important part, totally awesome. So let's board the spaceship Icarus and blast off as we try to explain the mixed up, crazy timeline of the Planet of the Apes movies. Where to start? Complicated question when you're dealing with a cyclical, if ever evolving chronology, where there's no beginning or end. This is time travel, people. But we'll get to that shortly, because the most sensible place to begin would seem to be with the most recent so-called reboot series that kicked off in 2011. The first of these films was Rise of the Planet of the Apes, starring James Franco as Will Rodman, a, chemist who works on a cure for Alzheimer's disease? He secretly adopts a baby chimpanzee that was born in his lab, naming it Caesar. And of course, the chip grows up to be Andy Serkis in a performance capture suit, but also a freedom fighter for apes everywhere. Through Rodman's experimental drugs, ALZ-112 and ALZ-113, Caesar gains human-like intelligence and the ability to speak. No! He also shares the drug with other apes. Unfortunately, or fortunately actually, because there wouldn't be a Planet of the Apes otherwise, the second drug also causes what will become known as the simian flu, eventually leading to a devastating worldwide pandemic for humanity. And yeah, it's all basically James Franco's character's fault, even if he didn't mean it. Side note, I was lucky enough to visit the set of this movie way back when they were filming in Vancouver, and Franco would spend his time between takes just sitting in the shade of a tree and reading, which kinda seemed like a really douchey way to act in front of the visiting press. Though actually, what's more douchey, reading or making fun of someone for reading? It's that kind of attitude that will lead to a Planet of the Apes. You maniacs! Anyway, the events of this film take place more or less in the present day of when Rise was released, so figure from Caesar's birth in 2008 through 2016 or so, when Caesar and his fellow apes staged their first battle for freedom against humanity on the Golden Gate Bridge. Rise ends with Caesar and his apes embarking on a new life in the forests of Northern California, even while the apocalypse approaches for an unknowing mankind. Great job, Franco. And by the way, there are a bunch of Easter eggs in Rise which might confuse more casual viewers who think they're meant to be bigger connections to the original Planet of the Apes series. Character names like Dodge, Landon, Maurice, Bright Eyes, and others are callbacks to the 1968 film, but nothing more. A more interesting bit, however, involves the mention of a space vessel called the Icarus, which launches and subsequently is lost in space. We'll get to the importance of that shortly. Well, in a few thousand years. By the next film, which takes place 10 years later, the simian flu has ravaged mankind and society has collapsed. Billions have died off screen, and James Franco's character too. And guess who was apparently president during this period? Thanks, Obama. Meanwhile, Caesar and his apes have flourished and multiplied, building their own society, which coexists precariously with the remnants of humanity in their region. Family. The apes encounter some friendly humans in Jason Clarke and Kerry Russell's characters, whose names aren't really worth remembering because, like all the humans in this reboot trilogy, they're one and done after a single movie. Caesar also runs into trouble with one of his lieutenants, Toby Kebbell's great character, Koba, a tortured survivor of animal experimentation who is most certainly not down with human work.
Human work. Human work!
Anyway, Koba tries to assassinate Caesar and attacks the humans, and over on the human side, Gary Oldman is being kind of a dick too. Ultimately, even though Caesar is able to defeat his former friend, the damage is done.
War has already begun.
And I'll just pause for a second again here to say that I also got to visit this set during production, and the next movies too, War for the Planet of the Apes. For someone who grew up watching Apes Week every year on New York's local ABC affiliate, doing these and other Apes ops was some kind of a dream come true. And also, Andy Serkis is just cool as shit. 2 years later, a human military group known as Alpha Omega is hunting for Caesar and his fellow apes. Their leader, Woody Harrelson's Colonel, who you can say hates every ape he sees from chimpan A to chimpanzee, murders Caesar's wife and eldest son. Meanwhile, things go from bad to worse for humanity, as the simian flu has now mutated into a form which affects even those who were previously immune to it. It's now causing its subjects to lose the ability to speak, and, in some cases, to revert to a more primitive mental state. Yep, it's definitely happening.
It will be a planet of apes.
You maniac!
Caesar's group takes in a mute human girl, indicating that apes and humans could still live together peacefully if they have the will. And while the girl goes by the name Nova, which is a reference to Linda Harrison's Nova from the original 1968 movie, this is not the same character. We also meet Steve Zahn's Bad Ape, who stands as proof that the heightened intelligence of Caesar's apes has spread to others beyond their tribe. By the end of the film, the Colonel is defeated, succumbing to the mutated flu, and Caesar dies after ensuring that his apes are able to escape to a lush new land across the desert, where they can begin to build a new life for their people.
You are all home now.
Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes leaves Caesar's story behind to jump ahead to what 20th Century Studios describes as several generations in the future, following Caesar's reign, in which apes are the dominant species living harmoniously, and humans have been reduced to living in the shadows. So let's let Bad Ape sum things up for us so far.
Human gets sick, ape gets smart. Then human kill ape, but not me. I run.
As humans progress to a more primitive state, ape civilization continued to grow. But how does that all connect to the classic movies? One thing's for sure, we'll need to travel to a different timeline from here. Now we've finally arrived at the beginning, which is also the end, but for the purposes of this video, is just sort of the middle point of the story. The original classic from 1968 plopped Charlton Heston's Colonel George Taylor into the mixed-up world of the Planet of the Apes after he and his crew spent a couple of millennia in hypersleep on board their ship the Icarus, also known as the Liberty One.
A planet where apes evolved from men? There's got to be an answer.
Don't look for it, Taylor. You may not like what you find.
Indeed, Taylor does not like what he finds at all. At this point in the future, apes rule the land, and humans are mute savages. After getting put through the ringer in this madhouse of a world by Dr. Zaius, Taylor, perfect red-blooded American human specimen that he is, manages to escape. And it's only then that he finds out what a lot of you first discovered while watching The Simpsons and/or Spaceballs.
You blew it up! Oh, damn you!
For the record, that's Nova with Taylor. Definitely not the little girl from War for the Planet of the Apes. Also, you may recall that the Icarus was the ship that was mentioned back in Rise of the Planet of the Apes. The only thing is, Taylor's Icarus launched in 1972, which is decades before the Icarus and Rise's mission. So while a Taylor may wake up and find a Planet of the Apes 2,000 years after Rise, it won't be the Taylor from the first movie, different timeline. And no, I didn't visit the set of this movie, I'm not that old. One of the nuttiest entries in the OG series, and that's saying a lot, Beneath the Planet of the Apes picks up where the last movie left off, more or less, only without Heston for much of its running time. He didn't want to come back for a sequel, and only agreed to an abbreviated role if he could be assured that Taylor would be killed. And man, did he get his wish. In his place is the Taylor Light Brent, played by James Franciscus, who goes through most of the motions of the first movie.
How in the hell did you get
I
here?
got here the same way you did. Spaceship, Ape City, subway.
By yourself?
No, Nova found me.
A new level, literally, of the Planet of the Apes is unearthed in this one, as Brent discovers a group of human mutants who have been, shall we say, altered by the effects of the nuclear war that happened all those centuries ago and led to stuff like the Statue of Liberty becoming beachfront property. Indeed, these mutants actually worship a doomsday weapon called the Alpha Omega Bomb, just like Woody Harrelson's group of militants. And while Harrelson's colonel wasn't literally pulling his face off, his soldiers were mutating in new ways last time we saw them. Who's to say that in that timeline, some of them didn't splinter off and form an underground group of psychic crazies like this lot?
You're talking.
Well, certainly we can talk. It's a rather primitive accomplishment. We use it when we must.
When we pray.
When we sing to our God.
Real quick, a note about dates. Taylor's control panel in the 1968 movie says he's landed in the year 3978. Brent in Beneath says it's 3955, even though he clearly gets there after Taylor. It's just a production mistake, guys. Don't overthink it. Anyway, this one culminates in one of the most insane endings in movie history, as Nova buys it, Brent gets machine gunned, Taylor takes several rounds to the chest himself, but lives long enough to set off the Alpha Omega device, destroying the entire planet along the way.
A green and insignificant planet is now dead.
But you know what they say. The timeline must go on. How do you make a sequel to your hit franchise when you've killed everyone and blown up the planet? 5 words.
We came from your future.
And so it went that after taking a spin on the Icarus, the 2 lovable chimpanzees who befriended Taylor in the first movie wound up in 1973, putting Roddy McDowall's Cornelius and Kim Hunter's Zira in what was the modern day at the time of Escape from the Planet of the Apes release was a pretty brilliant flip on the original film's conceit, and it breathed new life into the franchise as the 2 chimps have a madcap adventure in modern man's world. That is, until they too get gunned down in a finale that remains as jarring and troubling today as it must have been 50 years ago. This is also where we first meet the original series version of Caesar, though he's called Milo here and is just the baby of Cornelius and Zira. Through a switcheroo involving Ricardo Montalban of all people, Milo's parents die so that he can live. We'll see him again in the next movie, where he chooses the name Caesar for himself. But this is also a significant point in the timeline, or timelines, of the apes, because it's where ape history diverges from what was established up until this point. Cornelius tells the legendary story of what is supposed to happen centuries after this movie's events, when an ape named Aldo will first stand up against his human master, daring to utter the word no. Interestingly, that mirrors the Serkis version of Caesar's story. But that Aldo history will no longer happen now that Milo Caesar has entered the mix via his parents' time travel. Let's just let that baby chimp murdering Dr. Hasline explain it.
You would perceive, Mr. Bonds, that time is like a freeway with an infinite number of lanes, all leading from the past into the future, however, not into the same future. A driver in lane A may crash while a driver in lane B survives. It follows that a driver, by changing lanes, can change his future.
So Aldo starting the Apes' revolt against humanity was lane A, Caesar is about to grow up and do the same in lane B, and the Andy Serkis Caesar is much further removed. Maybe his lane is on a different temporal highway even. 18 years after the murder of his parents, Caesar, Roddy McDowall here playing his own son, is living in a much changed world. After the decimation of all the dogs and cats on Earth due to a mysterious plague, apes became mankind's new pets, but soon that evolved into them becoming slaves, even as American society morphed into something of a totalitarian state, the perfect forum for Caesar to begin his rebellion. The timeline is pretty straightforward at this point as Caesar fulfills his destiny of leading his fellow apes against humankind, and the seeds are planted for the apes to become much more human-like as they're wearing clothes now, but also, and inexplicably, Caesar's future wife Lisa speaks for the first time. Interestingly, she says no, just as Aldo was meant to in that other timeline, only she does so in an effort to stop the violence rather than start it. That tension between peace and war is always a key part of Caesar's story, it seems. Seemingly taking place a couple of decades after conquest, this final film in the original series gives us a much kinder, gentler Caesar. He's now a family man and the benevolent leader of a colony of both apes and humans. But the humans are second-class citizens, and there are clearly tensions with apes, like the militaristic gorilla Aldo, who, by the way, seems to be related to the Aldo of legend in name only. The nuclear war that has been alluded to throughout the series has also taken place since the last movie, and the humans who will eventually evolve into the face-peeling mutants and beneath the Planet of the Apes are out to get Caesar and his tribe here.
But then you always were clever.
By the end of the film, they retreat to their subterranean dwellings, but in deleted footage, the Alpha Omega bomb is seen. These guys are gonna worship this thing one day. This story is bookended by a sequence set over 600 years later, and featuring the Lawgiver, as played by none other than the famed director John Huston in ape makeup. The Lawgiver is a legendary figure who formed the basis of ape society and laws, according to the earlier films, and his sequences here are meant to establish a fork in the road for apes and humans. Will the changes that were seemingly made to this timeline by Caesar mean that all can live together in harmony in the future, thereby avoiding Chuck Heston blowing the shit out of everything eventually? Has Caesar managed to change lanes like in that Ben Affleck movie? The weird closing image of a statue of Caesar shedding a tear seems to have an appropriately downbeat answer for this series. No freaking way.
You maniac!
There were 2 short-lived TV series released in the 1970s after the original movies had run their course. The first, simply called Planet of the Apes, was live action and starred Roddy McDowall as a friendly chimpanzee named Galen. Ron Hopper and James Naughton also starred as a pair of astronauts from the 20th century who hit a time warp and landed in the year 3085, where, as usual, it's not so great to be a human. The series' place in the original timeline is a bit unclear. Technically, these astronauts should be experiencing their adventure of the week-style stories some 900 years before Taylor crashes back to Earth in the original movie, and about 400 years after the lawgiver's whole spiel in battle. But there are inconsistencies too, like the existence of dogs, which were said back in Escape to have been wiped out by a plague. There's also a Dr. Zaius character, who could just be a different orangutan with the same name, who's also a jerk, but is clearly designed to be a version of the Zaius from the movies. We also learned that humanity was still running things by the year 2503, which definitely doesn't line up with the 4th and 5th films in the original series. Still, maybe this means that this show exists in the original timeline from before Taylor arrived in the future, the one where Aldo said no, right? If so, that means Taylor and then Brent's time traveling led to Cornelius and Zira's time traveling, which created an alternate timeline where their child, Caesar, led the apes to revolt centuries earlier than had been the case in the original timeline before Taylor arrived. Got that? And then there's the animated TV series Return to the Planet of the Apes. This show depicts a very different world than the one Taylor discovered, even though Return is set just 1 year after the 1968 movie. The apes have relatively modern technology. There's an astronaut named Brent who is definitely not the same Brent from beneath the Planet of the Apes. Also, the animation is real rough.
Phil, it's terrible. What can we do?
Best to just keep this one in an alternate timeline as well. Oh yeah, and then there's this. The remake or reboot or whatever you want to call it from 2001 seemed like a good idea at the time. Tim Burton reviving the Apes franchise after it had been dormant since the 1970s? Hell yeah! But something went wrong along the way in this tale of an astronaut played by Mark Wahlberg, who winds up in a future where, well, come on. You know where this is going. The Planet of the Apes in this movie isn't even Earth. That is, until the end of the film when Wahlberg seems to make it back home. It's the most memorable and confusing part of the whole experience, as Wahlberg finds that Earth is apparently now ruled by apes for some reason, and the film's bad guy, General Thade, is now immortalized where the Lincoln Memorial used to be.
Damn them. Damn them all to hell.
Alternate timeline? Big time. So what's the most confusing part of the Apes timeline for you? Let's discuss in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe to IGN wherever you watch.